Hey there, it's Art Stewart with Strategic Impact Partners, and this is What Matters Most on YouTube and on LinkedIn. And I'm joined by a friend, Keith Darcy, who is well familiar and a friend to many, and obviously a very well-regarded, long-standing subject matter expert, actually, in a number of key areas that are actually more timely than ever, which have to do with where are we in the understanding of ethics and the ESG movement and everything else in between. So Keith, welcome to What Matters Most, and good to see you.
Great to be with you, absolutely.
So, you've had an illustrious career, Deloitte Ethics and Compliance Officers Association. You've had your career journey itself has paralleled a lot of the great movements in the evolution of ethics practice, of compliance and regulatory tensions that have developed over the years to help frame the market we're dealing with now. How do you think your understanding of what constitutes the right kind of ethics strategy for a company today, taking into an understanding of the new risks? What does that constitute today as ESG is coming into the equation?
Sure, it's a great question, Art. And the history of ethics and compliance is one of action and reaction. And so something happens, a major scandal. Watergate probably kicked it off August 6, 1974, when Richard Nixon left office. Started the great debate about integrity, ethics, and character. But we've had many circumstances where there's been meltdowns, economic meltdowns, and when the markets collapse, it exposes new risks. And so, where are we today? Well, today we've got the whack-a-mole issues of bribery and corruption, money laundering, conflicts of interest, you name it. They're never going away, apparently. But the new risks that are emerging are surrounded around ESG, environment, social, and governance, and in particular about stakeholder requirements. And the new risk that we're seeing is that when companies don't meet stakeholder requirements, risks increase. And what role, therefore, does ethics and compliance play in trying to make sure that they satisfy the company's response to stakeholder requirements? And the problem that we have today, quite simply, is that the stakeholders are demanding much more. They want the companies to become politically involved in some of their decision making. And so whether it's Black Lives Matter, whether it's abortion rights, LGBTQ rights, you go down the laundry list, voting rights in certain states that have been restricted and so forth. Various stakeholders are asking and demanding companies take a position. So the question becomes, what positions do you take? What are the consequences of your position? And frankly, what are the consequences of not taking a position? And Disney is probably a perfect example of that, is that they were silent to begin with on the Don't Say Gay bill that was passed in Florida. And there was an enormous negative reaction to Disney as a result of that.
Well, and some of the pushback, if you followed the public discourse, right, LinkedIn and other professional platforms where people were having some, significant and intelligent debate about this, there was a lot of pushback making an assumption that Disney didn't have to respond in the way it did or respond at all, that it actually had a choice to kind of ignore it in terms of getting into the media fray of it all, as if it had a choice. And I think a lot of us who are on the side of working with clients that get into these challenging contexts understand that you really don't have a choice. The choice you have is how are you going to respond? Because if you do not respond, then you leave to others the job of defining who you are or what you stand for or what you are saying about that particular situation. And so there is no choice. The choice is how do you intelligently respond? And every organization has different sets of circumstances. And Disney, that one particular context, as you point out, certainly had its own challenges. So, talk a little bit, if you would, about what are the kinds of ways that companies now need to be more equipped in their ethics strategy, when the ethics strategy has to have a much more sort of proactive, engaged implementation across a lot of different areas of function now, right? Because there's a lot of complexities, for example, in the supply chain management issue now, right? With first, second, third tier suppliers as related to what's happening with carbon emissions, right? And scope 1, 2, 3. There's these kind of new structures of obligation, of oversight and accountability that if you're like the initial sourcer, you've now got to be watchful of in a real accountable way across numbers of tiers.
It is. The risks are increasing exponentially, but so too are the expectations of enforcement authorities, and perhaps even worse, the expectations of various stakeholders. If they see companies not living up to their standards as stated publicly, then there's going to be a reaction. And usually it gets slammed on social media at a minimum. It can impact your market capitalization, which we saw with Disney went down 25% as a result of their silence. So it has become a very, very complex field. And now layer on top of it ESG, and which is not yet defined, by the way. The Securities and Exchange Commission keeps threatening to come out with some guidelines and so forth. But if you don't live up to your statements of what you believe in, you're still going to get slammed as a result of it. So this is a very complex world out there, and it requires a very comprehensive approach to ethics and compliance. It all begins with risk assessments as laid out in the federal sentencing guidelines. So you've got to identify multiple areas of risk, as you say, layers of risk, cutting across different jurisdictions and so forth. And then you've got to implement mitigations against those risks. And so some are formal systems, but some are informal systems. And then you've got to appoint somebody high level to be in charge of it. That person has to have appropriate resources and adequate authority to get her job done. That person must also, and by the way, that's a board function in my book, is to make sure that they have the resources and the authority to get their job done. There must be training and communication, including the board, and board risks have increased as a result of this. There must be an internal mechanism. We used to call them hotlines, we call them helplines today, for people to be able to speak up in confidence. And then you have to periodically go back and revisit everything that you put in place to see where else you need to be investing in the control functions to try and protect the brand reputation of the company. And reputation risk today is at least as great as strategic operating and financial risk. There's no question about it. And all it takes is a rumor or a hint of impropriety, and your market cap goes down. So it's a dangerous world out there.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that about the reputation risk, right? And how important that is now, more of like a hard risk. Used to be a soft risk, now is a hard risk. And you were talking earlier about a hotline. It gets to this whole issue of what kind of cultures do organizations build now? Do they try to kind of like dismantle the dysfunction of previous eras and learn the lessons of COVID and other unforeseen crises that everybody got shaken up with? And do they, become more transparent and accountable by having an internal mechanism that allows them to do the self-talk, to speak to power, to keep people in check in terms of not crossing the line, not abusing position, not being duplicitous, in any kind of way, with exercising fair and open play in terms of management styles and so forth.
And so you need to baseline it to begin with, to find pockets of strength that you want to build on and areas of weakness that you want to overcome. But that's a continuous process. Culture is not a 6-month rollout. Culture is forever. And every company has a culture.
But don't you think, though, you have to maintain some kind of protected role, like I don't know what you would want to call them, but sort of a protected individual who can sort of facilitate cultural interaction and making sure that folks are operating fairly and everybody's getting what they need, and sort of being an arbiter of any kind of disjointed aspect to operations to help kind of, because you read these articles about chief culture officers and other kinds of folks who legitimately have certain kinds of training and backgrounds in mental health and organizational dynamics and kind of these things that are important to understanding teams and human nature and how people collaborate and so forth, who have been able to come in and kind of through having a facilitated way to offload some of that frustration and energy, that people can have with that relationship with that individual, it kind of eases the pressure. And so, because management can't be walking around kind of, being engaged at a level all the time that enables them to respond to every kind of incremental situation that maybe needs to be addressed more. And maybe that's part of the problem with some of these cultures, how they got dysfunctional, right?
Yep.
How they form tribes and fiefdoms and whatever.
No, I totally agree with you, by the way. You can do employee surveys, but that's kind of distant and check the box response to culture. The focus group sessions are actually the most powerful. And if you get a third-party independent person to come in and facilitate those kind of discussions, you will hear the real emotional content, because at the end of the day, organizations are all about behavior. And what we've discovered is culture is by far the single biggest determinant of behavior in every organization in the world, absolutely bar none. And so do you know what your culture is? How do you try and promote the positive aspects of it, but allow for the negative aspects to come out and redress them in a way that's constructive to the future? I've also said for many years, Art, that culture and brand are flip sides of the same coin. So culture is the internal face of the organization and the values that people look towards, and everybody sees what's recognized and rewarded in organizational life. And the brand is the external face. That's what the stakeholders out there are looking at. What does this company stand for? And every company is telling a story to all of its stakeholders all the time. And so if there's negative information, then you need to address it quickly. I used to do something in my banking career, Art, is every Friday I'd take a wicker basket of chocolates and I'd walk around the bank and go up to people's cubbies and ask them, what's the latest rumor, and offer them some candy. And he goes, oh, we're going to sell the bank? No, we're not going to sell the bank. But it was
better be offering more than candy if you're going to sell the bank.
But it was my way of staying in touch with the people and allowing them to feel comfortable with me. Now, I was number 2 in the bank. And I thought the greatest compliment I was ever paid were people from the mailroom right up to other senior executives felt free to walk into my office at any time and talk to me, often about personal issues. And I'll tell you, after 9/11, and we were down there for that, every day I walked around and took the emotional pulse of my organization, because the only thing that mattered to me was the emotional health and safety of my people. And as long as they knew I cared about them, then we had a cohesive place that stood together and tried to help each other in a time of great crisis. So getting into the personal touch is an imperative to producing a culture.
Well, I know when we've talked before personally, I know that you've talked about some of those experiences, and I'm glad that you reminded me of them, reminded us who are listening to this, because, it isn't until you're battle tested, right, that you know what you stand for.
Right. That's right.
Because unless you're up against the wall, baby, right, you're only going to elevate to whatever is required in a context. And so, you've got to be up against the big wall at some point in some situation, life or death or professional or whatever the challenge might be, I think, before you kind of really are able to determine that. I want to make sure that I ask you about why I have you. Naturally, the years with Deloitte, a lot of how you got to working with them and how that became a natural fit for you. And obviously this plays into all the work you did with some of our beloved mentors, colleagues, your colleagues, mentors to me, Mike Hoffman, folks like that have been all part of that culture that you all created around the professionalism of the ethics and compliance officer, right? Over many, many years. What challenges now do you see CEO leaders really need to be focusing on? And are there different challenges? Are there a lot of subtleties to those differences?
Rather than looking to the upside necessarily, they should spend at least as much, if not more time, looking at the downside of the risks that are inherent in their businesses And those risks are profound. I mean, it has changed in the last 30, 40 years, where ethics and compliance didn't exist until almost 30 years ago. And now today, those risks are growing exponentially, as are the expectations of enforcement authorities, and as I mentioned before, as well as the stakeholders. So I think I would be spending more time. I'm a downside risk manager. If you fortified the downside, then you can have the luxury of investing in the upside and in the future. And so, but this world has changed, and social media has changed it, because there are no secrets and there's no place to hide anymore. Everybody knows what's going on. Everybody is writing a text or something out there to someone else about what's going on. This is, what's the sites that we have out there? TikTok, people are announcing their resignations on TikTok. It's and telling reasons why they're leaving their company. There's the Great Resignation. Last year, over 40 million people left the workforce to go seek other jobs and probably more money. So trying to hold all of that together is a big task. And if you don't think turnover is expensive, try it sometime. It's incredibly expensive to have to go out and re-recruit and do all that stuff. So you want people to stay as part of the team as you go forward. And in my career, Art, and you'll remember this, where if you had more than 3 jobs, you couldn't hold a job down. Today, if you have less than 9 jobs, you don't have enough experience. I mean, it's just a different environment.
Yeah. So I mean, you've articulated in a very clear way kind of this holistic state things are now. How are the challenges of making sure that folks and teams are compliant in all the kind of critical ways? If there's more distribution, physical distribution of folks because of working from home, or just because of reduced checking into the office, teams, let's say, that will come together for a few months on a project, they congregate individually at their own homes, and then they move directly from there to the site. Whereas maybe before, there'd always be a period of transition where teams would be on site together at the headquarters office, pulling it all together before they'd go and parachute in for a gig, right? At least that's the structure that I'm familiar with. And so there's all these different kinds of structures that are working against making it easy to be compliant, to be transparent, to make sure internally things are aligned. Where do you see some of that potentially being an opportunity or a challenge?
Oh, it's an enormous challenge. I've always said that culture is fairly well understood at headquarters. The further away you get from headquarters, the less it's understood. And when you cross national boundaries, something is seriously lost in translation. But now you add the complexity of people working from home remotely.
Right.
And what do they understand is expected of them? How removed from understanding the expectations of the organization are they? Or are they just in functional positions carrying out tasks and duties, but missing that connection, that human connection, which is essential to building culture? Because everything we do in life is done with, by, for, and through people. Everything we do in life is about relationships. And is it easy or hard, more difficult, to foster relationships over Zoom? Well, you and I would probably argue it's hard. I mean, it's a meaningful vehicle. You and I can connect via Zoom and foster our relationship a little further, but it's not the same as being in the same room, and getting the vibes and everything else that goes with that. So there's enormous challenges today.
Right. And in your case, you and I have met before, so we already had that connection. But you're right, for people that since COVID have been fostering these relationships, especially ones in which there's a lot of money involved, because that's the way business has been transacting a lot. You haven't had the advantage of looking at somebody in the eye from across a table rather than across a camera. Absolutely. So as we look at the SEC, well, everybody kind of would love to know, obviously, someone with your perspective, what do you think is going to stick? What do you think is not going to stick with some of these climate rule change proposals with the SEC. I mean, certainly there's one whole group of them, for folks that don't know, that are specific to the climate reporting aspects, right? And the awareness of the board, and the board reporting on its awareness and reporting on its own due diligence and following certain accountability check-offs, and how it structures its due diligence and program, its strategy for as a governance mechanism. But what's your sense? There are other pieces, other things that are being proposed around diversity quotas or diversity recalibrations, however you want to call them. There's a number of things. What are you sensing might stick, what might not, and how does that all look for you from your vantage point?
The SEC just a couple of weeks ago formed a subcommittee to study eminent people like Harvey Pitt, former SEC commissioner, and so forth, to study what kind of disclosures should company have around climate issues in particular. And so their report will probably come back after Labor Day or whatever. But where I'm sitting, my fear is that everything's going to look like compliance, that it's going to look like a check the box approach to managing ESG. And that's not what ESG is about. It's about how do the environmental, social, and governance risks affect and impact your business. That's what ESG is about. It's not about how we save the universe. Yeah, maybe, part of that will contribute to a better world, but it's really, how does it impact the concerns of your business, the risks of your business? And that's what smart investors are actually looking at, is what are companies doing in this to address these risks? And so we're seeing a lot of chatter about all this, but the bigger piece of ESG is the unspoken piece, and it has to be about the ethics of it. What are we doing to address social and moral issues in the workplace? And that's not going to be part of anything that the SEC publishes, unfortunately. But that's where the hidden risks are. Because the check the box stuff, everybody can go out and do what the SEC is requiring, get involved in the disclosures that they're going to require and so forth. Does it enhance your business? I don't know. And there'll be a lot of chatter about that when they finally do come out with their disclosures. But my bigger concern is not in what they produce, but what they don't produce.
Well, also too, some of the pushback has been from private companies, family-held companies, where they're saying, well, this is all for public context, which is true for the immediate. But the fact is that it has an imposition wave that it sets off, because in the scrutiny industry, it is non-denominational, right? It's agnostic. Scrutiny gets created but in markets, market psychologies, the paradigms, they get permanently altered, the frame sets, right? And so the frame set's going to get altered, that once these rules, whichever ones survive and become real, change how people have to look at certain integrated factors into investment assessment, strategy assessment, valuation issues, however you're looking at an entity as an investment target or whatever. But they are going to have to look at this stuff in the private context, because if you're going to be a supplier, if you're going to be acquired, if you're going to come in and do a joint venture with a public company that's going to capitalize that joint venture for you, and you're not compliant with the stuff that they have to be compliant with on a global scale regarding ESG issues, you've got a problem being qualified for them. I mean, I think private company leaders have to think about these things. It may not think that, you may think that it's not right there on the immediate radar, but it could be, because if you look at how it affects a whole range of other things, the insurance industry is getting smart about all this stuff and figuring out that as well.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, Art. The privately held companies are not immune from this at all.
No.
And there's already plenty of chatter about SEC requiring public companies to do ESG assessments of the people they're doing business with. So, one way or the other, they're going to have to get involved in this conversation. There's no question.
Well, Keith, it was great talking with you. I appreciate all the insights as always. Not just your wisdom, but you're so on the edge of where all this thinking is with all the years of working with these folks. And it is understanding how leadership works when there's a lot of opposing currents playing at once. It's a very interesting time to be a leader, but it's also a very challenging time depending on what your situation is. But Keith, Darcy, Art, Stewart here from What Matters Most and Strategic Impact Partners. Thanks for joining us here on LinkedIn and or YouTube, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Art. Great to see you.
You bet.